Hello and welcome to today's reflection. My name's Gill Persicke and I'm one of the licensed lay ministers at From Mancroft Church, but as you can see we're not in the church right now because the electrics are being mended. We are instead in my living room and Molly, our communications officer, is kindly recording this. Now, many of you, like me, might have been moved to see a particular handshake on the news last week. You know the one I mean? It was when an elderly Jewish woman called Yocheved Lichit, who'd been held hostage in Gaza by Hamas, was being released from captivity. And just as she was about to move away, she seemed to have an afterthought. She turned back and offered her hand to one of her captors. He was masked and carrying a gun, but after a split second of hesitation, he took the woman's hand, and she spoke a single word: Shalom, peace. Mrs. Lichit's daughter later clarified somewhat. The rather ominous-looking man was, in fact, a paramedic who'd been tasked with looking after the hostages. And he and Mrs. Lichit had actually been able to talk together a little, talk about peace. And their handshake, caught on camera, has, of course, become world famous. It's appeared time and time again on the news, and it went viral online. Of course it did. But why has this handshake been so powerful? Well, part of the reason, I think, is that it was utterly disarming. When Mrs. Lichit offered her hand, it was a disarming gesture. Now, I asked a friend of mine for a definition of that word, and she, like me, was initially completely stumped. So I tried to think of the way in which disarming is normally used. Imagine, for example, a little boy who's been naughty and his grandmother steps forward to tell him off. But the child's reaction to her is so open and charming and unexpected, so disarming, that grandma is actually caught off balance. Her defences drop and the telling off is forgotten. When I eventually turned to my dictionary for a definition of disarming, all these components were indeed there. Charm, yes, but also some more serious things. To disarm means to render defenceless, to deprive of the power to hurt, to conciliate or placate. Taken in this light, an elderly hostage offering the hand of peace to one of her captors is indeed a disarming gesture. And here's another one, also famous from the news. Now, if I was to say the words Tiananmen Square to you, an image might well flash up in your mind. A lone man standing defiantly in front of a tank. The background is that in May 1989, there were massive but peaceful protests in China calling for political reform. And at first, the government did very little to stop them. But on the 3rd and 4th of June, their patience snapped. And the army swept into the centre of Beijing and cleared Tiananmen Square of protesters, cleared them away actually with terrible violence. Indeed, there were reports of tanks simply rolling over the demonstrators inside their tents. Many were killed, obviously, and injured, and the streets were cleared, indeed became more or less deserted. The next day, on the 5th of June, a tank convoy was rolling along an avenue close to Tiananmen Square when a man deliberately stepped out in front of it. He was dressed quite simply in a white shirt and black trousers, and extraordinarily he was carrying what looked like 2 shopping bags. Perhaps he'd simply ventured out to do some shopping. But when he saw the tanks, he went and stood in front of them. And this time, unlike the day before, the tanks stopped. A lone man temporarily seemed to have disarmed the Chinese army. and he stuck to his guns. When the lead tank tried to drive round him, he moved in front of it again. Then he climbed on top of the tank, apparently in an attempt to communicate with the crew inside it. They eventually emerged and tried to wave him away, but he wouldn't budge. In the end, he was removed by 3 passers-by, a bloke on a bike and 2 on foot. These people may, we hope, have been fellow citizens, but if they were members of the Chinese security forces, the young man's fate was probably sealed, and for the worst. But nobody to this day actually knows for sure whether he survived. We can only say that his gesture of defiance, his utterly disarming gesture, has survived. Now, some people have no time for such gestures, futile gestures they might call them, which change absolutely nothing. There is, of course, some truth in that. The man in front of the tanks hasn't softened the attitude or the policies of the Chinese government. Mrs. Lipschitz hasn't single-handedly brought peace to the Holy Land. No, we mustn't make weak-headed claims for these gestures, but they do nonetheless really matter. A gesture, any gesture, can only become disarming when there is a real moment of contact between human beings. The crew inside that tank, confronted by a single man whom they could see clearly, they could see his face, found themselves simply incapable of driving straight over him in cold blood, though they could easily have done so. They had the power. But his humanity and his courage completely disarmed their power. The Hamas paramedic was clearly caught off guard when Mrs. Lipschitz proffered her hand. It was such a normal, warm, everyday kind of gesture. And when he accepted her hand, the barriers between 2 sworn enemies, Hamas and Israel, crumbled to dust. The power of all those weapons of war, all that hatred, was, just for a moment, disarmed. And these disarmed moments have a numinous feeling about them. They're radiant moments which linger in the imagination, although people might not be able to explain why. They feel like shafts of light coming from another, better place. And I find myself full of admiration for all the people involved in these incidents, both the man with the 2 shopping bags and actually the tank driver who refuses to run him over. Both a frail elderly lady who's been held hostage and a Hamas paramedic who's allowed her into his skull. They are all admirable. As are we, when we see these disarming gestures and find ourselves moved by them. It is good and not weak-headed to be moved by shafts of light coming from a better place. It fills me with hope when human beings are attracted to what is open and disarming and lovely. That must come from God. Thank you for joining me today, and I wish you every blessing for the rest of the day.